Colorado, winter of 1888. On a frozen platform, Gerald Fitch looked Ingrid up and down, lips curling with contempt, then said it loud enough for everyone to hear, "We can't hire a woman your size. You'd eat through our winter stores before you cooked a single meal." Dozens of eyes turned. No one spoke. Ingrid didn't tremble, didn't beg. She lifted her chin and met his gaze straight on, her expression steady and unafraid. "My reference letter, my deposit. Give them back, right now." Behind the crowd, a widowed rancher stood watching in silence, and he was about to make a decision no one saw coming. This is the story of a woman an entire town looked down on, and the only one brave enough to see the deadly truth hidden inside sacks of white flour. Stay with me, because this story is just getting started. The stagecoach stopped in a cloud of frozen dust, and Ingrid Nystrom climbed down before anyone offered a hand. She always did. Copper Hollow was smaller than she'd pictured. One main road, a handful of storefronts with frost thick on the windows, gray sky overhead, heavy and low. A man named Gerald Fitch stood on the platform holding his hat, looking like a man who'd already decided something he hadn't yet said out loud. He looked at her, then away, then back. "You're the cook," he said. "I am." Ingrid set her trunk down. His wife stood just behind him, coat pulled tight at the collar. Neither of them moved. Mrs. Fitch and I discussed it. Gerald cleared his throat. "We can't employ a woman your size. You'd eat through our winter stores faster than you could fill them." People on the platform were watching. Nobody stepped forward. Nobody spoke. That silence had weight to it. Ingrid looked at him steadily. "My reference letter," she said, "and the travel deposit you promised." He blinked. He'd expected something else from her. "I beg your pardon?" "I traveled from Minnesota on your word, Mr. Fitch, the letter and the deposit." She held out her hand, open and patient. "Please." He paid her. He handed over the letter. He walked away fast, his wife keeping pace, and neither of them looked back. Ingrid did not watch them go. She turned and faced the street, counting what she had. Enough for a week's lodging, 10 days, if she was careful. She wasn't going to cry. Not here. "Can you actually cook for a working ranch?" She turned. He was standing near the hitching post, tall and lean, wearing a coat that had seen several winters without complaint. Brown eyes, steady, not smirking. That already set him apart from most of what she'd faced today. "I can feed 30 people, but will not work in exchange for pity," Ingrid said. "If that's what this is, you can keep it." He was quiet a moment. He looked at the sky, then back at her. "Ansel Whitcomb. I run Juniper Hollow Ranch, 4 miles out. My cook didn't show. I've got 12 ranch hands, a 9-year-old boy, and a blizzard coming before morning." He nodded toward the wagon. "Come cook one supper. We'll talk terms after." Ingrid picked up her trunk. "Where's the wagon?" The road to Juniper Hollow was 4 miles of frozen ruts and black pine trees closing in on either side. Ansel drove and didn't fill the silence with conversation. Ingrid didn't mind. She watched the sky darken and thought through what she could put together with almost nothing. Cold weather cooking wasn't complicated if you understood how starch and fat and heat worked together. Not if you'd spent years cooking for boarding houses and crews that couldn't afford to waste a single potato. She'd spent exactly those years. Juniper Hollow looked like a ranch run by someone who paid attention. Roof tight, fences straight. Enough firewood stacked along the south wall to mean planning ahead was a habit, not an afterthought. A boy stood at the top of the stairs when they came inside. 9 years old, dark-haired like his father. He looked down at her from the landing, still and careful. "This is Miss Nystrom," Ansel said. "She'll be cooking supper." Perry said nothing. He turned and walked back down the hall. A door clicked shut. Ansel watched the empty staircase. "He'll warm up, or he won't." "It's fine," Ingrid said, and she meant it. She didn't need the boy to like her tonight. She needed the pantry. She found it. Flour, rye meal, potatoes, onions, salt pork, dried apples, cornmeal, enough to work with. She reached for the rye meal first, pulled the bag open, and stopped. The smell reached her before she even looked inside. Damp and close, like a cellar that had flooded once and never fully dried. She tilted the bag toward the window. Dark kernels, purple-black, small, scattered through the pale meal. Not ordinary mold. Something worse. Back in Minnesota, near the flour cooperative, where she'd worked one summer, a warehouse had flooded in the spring. The stored rye soaked for 2 days. Before anyone could drain it, some of the workers wanted to dry it and grind it anyway. A woman named Mrs. Halverson had shown her what to look for: that dark discoloration in the kernels, that particular smell, the grain that looked almost normal until you knew what it did to people who ate it. Cramping first, then confusion, numbness in the hands and feet, convulsions if the dose was high enough or the person eating it was small enough. Ingrid had watched a child get sick that summer. She hadn't forgotten it. She put the rye aside. She set a second flour bag aside, too, one that carried the same smell in the top layers. She worked with what was left: cornmeal, potatoes, dried apples, salt pork, a good portion of the onions, potato soup, thick and salted right, corn cakes flat in the iron skillet, stewed apples with a pinch of cinnamon she found pushed to the back of a shelf. Simple food, honest food, nothing that needed defending. The ranch hands came in from the cold-smelling cattle and open air. They ate quickly, plates cleared without ceremony. Nobody lingered. Someone asked for more soup. Someone else wanted to know about the corn cakes. Perry appeared in the kitchen doorway around the middle of the meal. He didn't come in. He just stood there, watching. Ingrid put a bowl at the near end of the table, close enough that he wouldn't have to walk past anyone to reach it. She went back to the stove and kept her eyes off him. A few minutes later, the bowl was empty. Ansel was leaning in the doorway when she finally turned around. He'd been watching his son. "He finished the whole thing," Ansel said quietly. "He hasn't done that in weeks." Ingrid dried her hands. "The rye meal in the pantry needs to stay out of the kitchen. Some of that flour, too." "Why?" "Something isn't right with it. I want to look more carefully before I use it." He looked like he was about to push back. Then he glanced at the empty bowl sitting at the end of the table. "All right," he said. "We'll talk tomorrow." Later, after the hands had gone and the fire burned low, Ingrid carried her bag upstairs. She passed Perry's door. Light showed beneath it. She almost kept walking. A smell stopped her. Faint, yeasty, slightly sour. She knocked lightly. No answer. She eased the door open just enough to see inside. Perry was asleep. Something was tucked partway under his pillow, a corner of it sticking out. She crossed the room and pulled it free. Old bread. Dense, dark at the edges. She held it close to the lamp. Same flour. She could see it in the crumb. The same off-color. The same wrong texture. Perry stirred. His eyes opened halfway. "I saved it," he said. "From breakfast." "Why?" She kept her voice low. He thought for a moment. "I get sick after breakfast sometimes, but I didn't want Pa to worry." His eyes slid shut again. "Don't tell him." Ingrid set the bread aside. She pulled his blanket up around his shoulders. "Sleep now," she said. Downstairs, Ansel was still up, standing near the cold hearth. "I'll offer you a month," he said. "If you want to talk terms, weekly wages," Ingrid said. "A private room and the right to leave whenever I choose." He looked at her for a moment. "I need someone to cook for my son and the ranch hands. That is the beginning and end of the arrangement." "Then we agree." He went upstairs. Ingrid went to the pantry. She pulled the suspicious bags onto the work table and found a clean ceramic crock on the top shelf. She poured the rye meal slowly, holding the lamp close, working through the flour with her fingers. Dozens of dark kernels, one after another, appearing through the pale meal. Impossible to miss once you knew what to look for. She set the lamp down. This flour is not merely damp. She didn't hear the creak of wagon wheels stopping at the far end of the drive. She didn't see the shadow at the window or the deliveryman from Quaid Mill standing out there in the dark, watching her hands move over the flour in the lamplight. He stood there long enough to understand what she was doing. Then he turned his horse around and rode back toward town. The padlock was new. Ansel saw it before he was fully dressed. He came downstairs and stopped in the kitchen doorway. Ingrid was at the stove, stirring a pot of oats. She didn't turn around. "There's a lock on the pantry door," he said. "There is. I didn't put it there." "I did." She set the spoon down. "The flour and rye meal are inside. I locked them because I don't want anyone using them by accident while I'm outside fetching water or wood." He crossed his arms. "That's my pantry." "It is," she agreed. "And those are your bags of flour. But I believe something is wrong with several of them, and I'd like to explain before someone uses them." She did explain. She'd seen grain like that before, in Minnesota, near the flour cooperative, where she'd spent a summer helping sort and store shipments after a flood. When rye got wet and sat long enough in the wrong conditions, a dark fungus could grow through the kernels, purple-black, barely noticeable when mixed into pale flour. You wouldn't taste it. You might not see it unless you were looking close. But the people who ate bread made from that grain got sick. Stomach pain first, then numbness spreading up through the hands and into the arms. Confusion, nightmares. In the worst cases, convulsions. Children were more vulnerable than adults. They ate more relative to their size, and the effects could build slowly over weeks before anyone made the connection. Ansel listened. His expression didn't change much. "Quaid Mill has been supplying this region for years. Nobody's said a word about sick flour. Maybe nobody connected it yet. And you've been here one night." "I have," Ingrid said. "And Perry finished a full bowl of soup last night without any bread made from that flour. You told me yourself that was unusual." He was quiet. She let him be. "What are you asking?" "7 days," she said. "Let me keep the suspicious bags locked up. Corn cakes, beans, oats, and potatoes in the meantime. If everyone at this table feels better by the end of the week, you'll have your answer." He stood there a moment longer, then walked outside without saying yes or no. Ingrid unlocked the pantry and started on breakfast. By the 4th day, the results were hard to dismiss. Perry's stomach pain had quieted. He was sleeping through the night, most nights. 2 ranch hands named Curtis and Hobb both mentioned at the supper table that their morning dizziness had stopped. Neither of them made a point of it. Curtis said his head felt clearer. Hobb agreed. They went back to eating. Ingrid wrote it down. Names, days elapsed, meals, symptoms reported. A simple table done carefully. She was checking the livestock feed in the barn when she found Tomas Becerra measuring out grain from a Quaid Mill sack. He was the ranch foreman, broad-shouldered and unhurried, and he looked up without alarm when she came in. "I'd like you to hold off on that," she said. He looked at the sack. "This is the regular feed. Smell it." He opened the bag wider. After a moment, he put it down. Tomas had worked with animals long enough to trust his nose. He didn't argue. He tied the bag shut and moved it to the back of the barn. Ansel walked in 10 minutes later. He saw the bag sitting apart from the others. "She asked you to pull it?" "I smelled it myself," Tomas said. "I wouldn't feed that to the horses." Ansel looked at Ingrid. "You changed the feed rotation without telling me." "I stopped Tops before he used it." "Those aren't the same thing. This is my ranch. I make the decisions here." "You hired me to be responsible for the food on this property," Ingrid said. "I can't be responsible and silent at the same time. Those are 2 different jobs." She went back to the kitchen. An hour later, she heard footsteps behind her. Ansel was looking at the oven door, which had been sitting at an angle since she arrived because the bottom hinge had worked loose. He found a screwdriver in the tool chest by the back wall. He didn't say anything about it. He fixed the hinge, opened and closed the door twice to test it, and went back outside. That evening, she kept supper hot past dark. He was out checking the fence line in the north pasture. When he finally came in, cold-faced and tired, a full plate was waiting on the back of the stove with a cloth over it. He ate without comment, but he thanked her before he went upstairs. The next morning, she completed the pantry inventory. Every Quaid Mill bag got examined. She sorted them into 2 groups, clean and suspicious. She checked the suspicious ones for markings. Most of them carried a red triangle, stamped near the base of each bag. She went back and checked the clean bags, too. No red triangles on any of the safe ones. She spread both groups on the kitchen floor and told Ansel when he came in at noon. He crouched down and turned one of the bags in his hands. Every person showing symptoms regularly ate food from these bags, she said. He studied the marking for a long moment. All right, he said. You have full authority over this pantry for the 7-day test. After that, I want proof I can show someone. I'm working on that. A delivery wagon came that afternoon. The driver left a sack of flour on the porch with a note tucked under the string. Ansel read it and handed it to Ingrid. It said, "A hired cook has no authority to frighten the customers of Quaid Mill and Grain. This flour is a compliment of the mill, offered in good faith. Further interference with business operations will not be tolerated. No signature. There didn't need to be." Ingrid put the flour in the locked pantry with the others. She added the note to her records. That night she sat at the kitchen table, writing up the week's findings. The lamp burned low. The house was quiet. Then Perry's voice came through the ceiling, muffled, short, and frightened. She took the lamp upstairs. He was sitting up in bed with his hands pressed flat against his chest. His fingers were bent inward at the knuckles, stiff and curled. "It's cramping," he said. "My hands?" She sat on the edge of the bed and took his hands in hers. She worked them open slowly, stretching each finger with gentle pressure, the same method her mother had used on kitchen injuries that seized up in the cold. She didn't rush it. After a few minutes, the cramping eased. Perry looked at the wall across from him. "Are those real?" he asked. "What?" "The things on the wall moving across it." Ingrid looked at the wall, plain whitewashed wood. "Still, there's nothing on the wall," she said. "I promise you." He looked at her, then at the wall. Then he lay back slowly without arguing. She sat with him until he slept. She thought about what it meant for a child to see things that weren't there. She'd read about it once. A pamphlet a cooperative inspector had handed around after the Minnesota warehouse incident. It listed the symptoms plainly. The fungus in contaminated rye produced something inside the body that disturbed the blood and the nerves together, interfering with the vessels that carried warmth and sensation to the extremities. Children's smaller bodies absorbed it faster. Perry had been eating that bread for months. She went back downstairs and picked up her pen. She wrote until the lamp burned out and the house went cold around her. The clinic was a single-story building at the far end of Copper Hollow's main road. Dr. Odessa Crane answered the door herself. She was tall, iron-haired, and measured in her movements. She looked at Ingrid, then at the small glass jar Ingrid was holding, and stepped aside. "Come in," she said. Ingrid explained it without extra words. The flour from Quaid Mill, the red triangle markings. The symptoms she'd observed: stomach pain, nightmares, cramping hands, numbness in the fingers, and the hallucinations Perry had experienced 2 nights before. She set the jar on Odessa's work table. Inside it were a dozen dark kernels, purple-black against clear glass. Odessa put on her spectacles and looked at them carefully. "I've treated 6 children in the last 2 months with similar complaints," she said. "I attributed most of it to winter fever and poor nutrition." "What did those families have in common?" Odessa looked. Most of them were poor. Several were behind on debts. The 2 women looked at each other. "I'll need to review my notes," Odessa said. "What I have is informal, but I'm thorough." "So am I," Ingrid said. Perry was quiet on the wagon ride to the schoolhouse. He'd been quieter in general since the night his hands cramped, not from fear so much as from thinking something through. He remembered details that adults let slide past. The school had 31 students. The teacher, Amos Rusk, had ink-stained fingers and attendance records going back 4 years. He met Ingrid at the door and shook her hand with both of his. He'd already been worried. He just hadn't known who to tell. 11 students had missed school in 6 weeks due to illness. He'd recorded all of them as winter sickness, but something had been nagging at him. The sick children weren't spread evenly across the school. They clustered. Certain households kept appearing. Perry sat at an empty desk with paper and pen. Ingrid read names from Amos's attendance records, while Perry wrote them down. Amos pulled the lunch donation log from the back shelf. Every week, Quaid Mill delivered flour to the school for midday meal preparation, each delivery marked in a small column on the right side of the page. Perry noticed it before Ingrid said anything. "The sick ones," Perry said, looking at his list. "Do most of them also get flour at home from Quaid?" "That's what we're going to find out," Ingrid told him. They spent 2 hours cross-referencing names. Every household with a sick child appeared on at least one of 3 lists. They received Quaid's charity flour at home, they owed debt at Quaid's store, or their children ate the school lunches prepared from the donation flour. Every bag in the school kitchen bore a red triangle. Ingrid was writing the last batch number into her ledger when the schoolroom door opened. Merritt Quaid filled the frame for a moment before he stepped inside. He was a broad, prosperous-looking man with a thick beard and the unhurried movement of someone who had never been told to wait. 2 men followed and stood near the back wall. "Miss Nystrom," he said, looking around the room slowly, "I heard you've been gathering up school children to build a case against my mill." "I've been looking at attendance records," she said. "The children were already sick." He smiled. "A 198-pound cook walking into school to tell the town their food is poisonous." He shook his head. "What exactly qualifies you to make that judgment?" "The same thing that qualified me to recognize it in your flour," she said. "Experience with grain. I've worked near cooperative mills. I know what flood-soaked rye looks like after it's sat in a damp warehouse. I know what it does to the people who eat it." He kept smiling. "You know what would help your credibility? Being a little less concerned with other people's business." The room went still. Ansel, who had come in behind Quaid and said nothing until now, took a half step forward. Ingrid spoke first. "My weight doesn't change what's inside your flour, Mr. Quaid." Quiet and plain. She held his gaze and didn't look away. Quaid studied her for a moment. He turned to Ansel. "You should manage your household better." Then he walked out, his men behind him. Amos let out a slow breath from the corner of the room. Perry was watching Ingrid with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered. Ansel didn't say anything until they were back at the wagon. "You didn't need me to answer him," he said. "No," she agreed. He nodded once. "2 of the cows have been off their feed for 3 days. Tomas says they're losing weight." Ingrid looked at him. "I want to see them when we get back." She examined both animals in the south pasture before supper. They were gaunt behind the shoulders, standing dull-eyed in the wind. She asked Tomas what had been in their feed. Quaid mill grain, the same batches she'd pulled from the barn earlier that week. A portion had already been used before she'd caught it. She built a feeding plan that evening. Tomas had a reserve of oats bought from an independent farm in September, stored dry in the upper loft. She portioned them across the 2 sick animals carefully, adding hay and a warm cornmeal mash to encourage eating. She adjusted the amounts based on what each animal's weakened stomach could manage without making things worse. She checked them again before dark. Ansel came in from the barn at breakfast. "They're eating," he said. "Keep them on the clean grain. 3 days at least before you change anything." He stood by the stove while she poured the coffee. "You saved those cattle," he said. "Not yet. Ask me in a week, Ingrid." He waited until she looked at him. "I'm crediting you with saving them." In front of Tomas and the hands, "I want them to know." She understood what that meant. He wasn't only saying thank you. He was making her expertise visible to everyone on this ranch. He was saying she was right, and they should listen to her. "Thank you," she said. That afternoon she asked him about the notebooks. Amos had mentioned in passing that Elspeth Whitcomb had kept household records. Ingrid had assumed he meant ordinary bookkeeping, but something about it had stayed with her all afternoon. Elspeth kept notebooks? Household ones? She kept records of everything. He said it without looking up. "Are they here?" He was quiet a long time. "Storage room upstairs," he said. "I haven't opened that room in 2 years. I'd like to look at them. With your permission, he left the kitchen without answering. Footsteps went upstairs. A door opened and stayed open for a moment, then his boots came back down. He set 3 small cloth-covered notebooks on the kitchen table. The corners were worn soft. Don't be long with them, he said. He walked out to the barn. Ingrid sat down and opened the first notebook carefully. Elspeth's handwriting was neat and close. Supply lists, meal plans, notes on the ranch hands' appetites, on what preserved well through a long winter, on the price of salt in late November. The second notebook held more of the same until about a third of the way through, where the entries shifted. More urgent. Lists of family names from Copper Hollow and nearby ranches, notes on illnesses, a small grid tracking symptoms against dates, then a torn page. The ragged edge still held fragments of letters from the missing half. At the bottom of the page before it, Elspeth's careful hand, one sentence crossed the paper and stopped. Quade's flour is making the children sick. The rest of the page was gone. Ingrid read it twice. Then she sat still with her hands flat on the table and the winter wind pressing against the kitchen window. Elspeth Whitcomb had known. She had written it down, and she had died before anyone listened. The message reached Juniper Hollow just before noon. 3 students had collapsed at the schoolhouse during lunch. Amos Rusk had carried 2 of them himself and sent a rider for the others. Ingrid was already tying her coat when Ansel came in from the barn. "I'm going to the clinic," she said. He didn't argue. He hitched the wagon. Odessa Crane had pushed the furniture back to make room. The 3 children lay on cots along the wall. They were conscious but pale, their breathing shallow. 2 of them were shaking. Ingrid recognized the shaking. She'd seen it in Perry 3 nights before. Odessa was moving between patience with the controlled efficiency of someone who had been doing this alone for a long time. "What did they eat?" Ingrid asked. "Lunch prepared here. Flour donated this week by Quade Mill." Ingrid looked at the children, then at Odessa. "Which families have been sick?" "Not just these 3. All of them." Odessa pulled out her case notes. They went through them together at the work table, Ingrid reading symptoms and dates while Odessa confirmed or added details. By the time they finished, the pattern was clear. Every family with a sick child was either receiving Quade's charity flour or running a debt at his store. Every family that bought grain elsewhere or had their own supply showed almost no illness at all. Odessa set the notes down. "A woman brought me a flour sample roughly 2 years ago. She said children in the area were getting sick after eating bread from Quade's mill." "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was probably moisture damage. That poorly stored flour sometimes caused mild stomach upset." Odessa removed her spectacles and set them on the table. "I told her she was likely right to be cautious, but that I hadn't seen evidence of anything more serious." Ingrid looked at her steadily. "Who brought you the sample?" "Elspeth Whitcomb." The clinic was very quiet for a moment. Ansel had been standing near the door. "He didn't move," Odessa said carefully. "I should have looked closer." "I didn't." Ingrid turned to Ansel. His face was set and still, the kind of stillness that comes from holding something back by force of will. "She told me," he said, "that winter. She told me the flour was making children sick. She brought samples home. She kept records." He stopped. "I thought she was exhausted. She'd been tired for months and her hands had started going numb. I thought she was working too hard and worrying too much." His voice went flat. "I told her to rest." Ingrid didn't offer him comfort, and she didn't offer him blame. "Elspeth suffered numbness," she said. "Confusion, severe weakness." "Yes, those aren't symptoms of overwork, Ansel. They're symptoms of long-term exposure to contaminated grain. She was eating it every day for months. She was getting sick from the very thing she was trying to warn you about." He looked at the wall. His jaw was tight. "I know that now." Outside, a wagon was coming down the main road toward the church. Ingrid went to the window. Merritt Quade was driving it himself, which was unusual. The wagon bed was stacked with flour sacks. Several townspeople were already gathering. Near the church steps, She went out without waiting. Quaid had positioned himself at the center of the small crowd, flour sacks arranged beside him like an offering. He was speaking warmly about community responsibility and supporting families through the hard winter months. Ingrid walked directly into the middle of it. "Don't take the bags with a red triangle on them," she said, loudly enough to carry. "They're marked near the base. Look before you accept anything." Quaid turned to face her. The warmth in his expression didn't change. "That was deliberate, Miss Nystrom." He let the name sit there. "You're frightening people who are hungry. I think you should be careful about the accusations you make against a man who has been feeding this town for 20 years. "I'm not making accusations," she said. "I'm telling people to look at the bottom of the bag before they bring it home." He looked at the crowd and not at her. "If this woman's claims damage my business, I will have legal grounds to pursue it. She is a hired cook with no professional authority and no standing to speak about grain production or food safety." "Then challenge the evidence," Ingrid said. "I have flour samples with batch numbers. I have records of which households received certain shipments. I have a list of symptoms and dates. If your flour is safe, those records will show it." A few people in the crowd nodded. Others were looking at Quaid. Quaid smiled once more and turned back to his distribution as though she hadn't spoken. 3 people walked away without taking flour. Most stayed. Ansel appeared at Ingrid's shoulder. "We need to go." She turned to face him. "Not yet," she said. "Those families need to know. Quaid's men are watching. If he decides you're a liability, this gets worse very fast." He kept his voice low. "Come back to the ranch. We can plan from there. Children are still being exposed, Ansel. I understand that. Do you? Because right now, you're asking me to leave, while people pick up sacks that will make their children sick." He stepped closer. His voice was tight. "Every time you walk further into this, I see Elspeth leaving the ranch for the last time. I can't watch that again." She looked at him directly. "I am not Elspeth. You cannot keep me alive by turning me into a prisoner." He said nothing. She turned back to the crowd and kept talking. She stayed for another hour. She spoke quietly, individually, to 4 different women, explaining what to look for and asking them to pass it along. One woman thanked her. One told her she was causing unnecessary panic. 2 said nothing, but she watched them examine the bags before they took them home. When they rode back to the ranch, Ansel barely spoke. Tomas met them at the gate with a letter. It had arrived from Quaid Mill's financial office while they were in town. The ranch's winter debt had been transferred. Quaid now held the note. If Ansel couldn't pay before spring, Quaid had the right to take the cattle. Ingrid stood in the yard and read it over Ansel's shoulder. He folded the letter. His face didn't change much, but she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. The cattle were the ranch. Without them, there was no Juniper Hollow. "He's using the debt to shut you down," she said. "I know what he's doing. I can continue investigating without the ranch wagon if you need to step back. I won't hold it against you." He looked at her sharply. "I'm not stepping back." He put the letter in his coat pocket. "Take the wagon whenever you need it. I'll send Tomas with you." Inside, the kitchen was dark. Perry was supposed to be doing schoolwork at the table. He was on his knees near the back of the pantry. "Perry?" He sat back on his heels. He was holding something. A small glass jar sealed with wax, the glass dark with age. He'd found a loose board near the pantry's back corner. The kind of hiding place that's invisible unless you're close to the floor and looking sideways. "It was under here," he said. "There's something tied to it." Ingrid took the jar. A folded note was wrapped around the outside, held with a thin cord. The paper was soft and slightly yellowed. She unfolded it. Elspeth's handwriting. She recognized it from the notebooks. "If I am no longer alive, find the November delivery ledger." Perry was watching her face. "It's from my mother," he said. "Not a question." "Yes," he nodded once. He looked at the jar in Ingrid's hands. "She hid it there on purpose." She did. Ingrid held the jar up toward the window. Inside, pressed flat, were flour samples. She could see the dark fragments even through the glass. and scratched into the wax seal on the lid, barely legible but deliberate. A set of numbers. Elspeth had left them a key. The question was what lock it opened. Ingrid turned the jar over in her hands and looked at the number scratched into the wax for a long time. It wasn't a date. The format was wrong. Too many digits, no separation between day and month. She pulled out her ledger and set it beside Elspeth's notebooks. She went back through everything she'd recorded, batch numbers from flour bags, delivery records from the school, the code stamped on the red triangle bags. She ran her finger down the columns and stopped. The number on the jar matched a shipment code from the previous November's delivery records. Specifically, the one sent to indebted customers in the week before Elspeth died. She went to find Ansel. He read it. He looked at her. "There's an abandoned freight station," he said, 8 miles up the Eastern Pass. Quaid used it for winter storage about 3 years ago, before he built the new warehouse. Elspeth drove up there once. She said she'd found something. He set the jar down carefully. I told her not to go again. Take me there. They left early. The sky was low, and the air had that particular dry coldness that usually meant weather coming. Tomas stayed with Perry. The road east climbed steadily, losing the protection of the valley trees, the wind picking up through the open stretches. The freight station had been abandoned long enough for the sign above the door to lose its paint entirely. Inside, the floor was gritty and cold. Old crates along one wall, rusted chain in the corner. Ingrid walked the floor slowly, pressing each board with her boot heel. Ansel found it. A section near the back wall where 3 boards moved together, fitted with a crude rope pull beneath the edge. He lifted them. A wooden box sat in the space below. Not old. The wood was still pale and clean. They brought it to the light. Elspeth had been careful, and she had been thorough. Folded papers, each labeled. Copied delivery records, dates, and destination households noted in her precise handwriting. A list of family names, 43 of them, each one marked with the batches they'd received. Flour samples in small paper envelopes, the batch codes written on the outside. And beneath everything else, a letter, sealed, with one word written on the front. Ansel. He picked it up. He held it without opening it for a moment. Ingrid moved away to examine the delivery records, giving him room. She heard the envelope open. She didn't look up. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "She doesn't blame me." He stopped. "She says she knew I dismissed her concerns because I was frightened. She says she understood that." He stopped again. "She asks me to believe the next person brave enough to speak." Outside, the wind rose sharply. Snow began to hit the windows. Not the light early winter kind, the kind that means it. They were going to have to wait it out. Ansel built a small fire in the station's iron stove. Ingrid sorted through Elspeth's papers and began organizing what they had. The contaminated grain had come through in at least 3 November shipments. All 3 marked with the red triangle. All 3 sent to households that owed Quaid money. The healthy families, the ones who bought grain elsewhere or settled their debts in cash, never received those batches. Quaid hadn't made a mistake. He'd made a choice. "She became ill before she could take it to anyone," Ingrid said. "She was already showing symptoms. By the time she put this box together, that's why she hid it. She knew she might not get another chance." Ansel was sitting on an overturned crate near the stove. He looked at the fire. "She asked me to examine the flour," he said. "I told her the mill had a good reputation. I told her Quaid was generous to this community. I told her she was seeing problems where there weren't any." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I said all of that while she was already sick from the flour I kept ordering." Ingrid sat across from him. "You believed what made sense to you at the time," she said. "That doesn't make it right. But it's different from not caring. It doesn't feel different. It won't for a while." The fire cracked. Outside, the snow was coming sideways now. Ansel looked at her. "What about you? What are you carrying around that you call a different name?" She hadn't expected that. She looked at the papers in her hands. "There was a man in Minnesota. We were engaged. His family had connections I didn't, and I could cook, organize a household, manage a budget. I was useful. She set the papers down. When his friends started laughing at him for the choice he'd made, he returned my ring. He said he'd thought I'd grow into someone he could be proud of. She said it without inflection. I'd spent 2 years making myself indispensable to his household. Ansel was watching her. He was a fool, he said. He was honest, at least. Eventually. You've never been a burden at Juniper Hollow, Ansel said. I want to say that plainly. Whatever you think you have to prove, you don't have to prove it there. She looked at him. He was close enough that she could see the firelight in his eyes. He wasn't saying it to be kind. He meant it as a fact, plainly stated, the way he handled most true things. She leaned forward slightly. Then she stopped. She sat back. Not yet, she said quietly. He accepted that without pressing. After a while, she realized her boots had soaked through on the walk from the wagon. She'd been ignoring it, but her feet had gone past cold into that deep ache that moves up through the ankles. She didn't say anything. She started unlacing anyway, intending to dry them by the fire. Ansel moved before she finished. He pulled a dry cloth from the pack he'd brought and crouched down. He worked her boot off without any ceremony about it. He dried her foot and her sock, wrapped the cloth around them, and kept them near the stove. He did the other one the same way. No hesitation, no awkwardness, just practicality and care, combined. Ingrid let him. That was new. By morning, the storm had eased. They loaded Elspeth's box onto the wagon with everything inside it. On the ride back, Ingrid laid out the plan. Independent ranchers, the ones outside Quade's debt network, had surplus corn, dried beans, potatoes, and preserved meat going into spring. If she could organize a central kitchen, using those supplies, families wouldn't need Quade's flour. Once the dependency broke, his hold on the town broke with it. I'll need food from Juniper Hollow, she said. Corn, potatoes, whatever meat you can spare, dairy if possible. It may leave the ranch short before spring, he thought for a moment. Take what you need. When Juniper Hollow came into view, Tomas was standing at the gate. He wasn't where he normally stood. He was in the middle of the yard, facing the south end of the property. The corn storehouse door hung open at an angle. The lock was on the ground. They walked over together. Inside, half the corn was gone. The oats, most of the dried provisions Ingrid had sorted and stored over the past 3 weeks. On the outside wall, painted fresh enough that it was still tacky, a red triangle, large enough to see from the road. The accusation traveled fast. By the time Ingrid reached Copper Hollow, the next morning, 3 people had already heard a version of it. Merritt Quaid was telling anyone who would listen that the cook at Juniper Hollow had stolen ranch supplies to build herself a reputation at her employer's expense. The stolen food had been found inside the church warehouse, stacked neatly as though it had arrived by arrangement. Ingrid stood in the church doorway, looking at corn sacks and potato crates she recognized by the marks she'd made on them herself. Someone had moved everything from the ransacked storehouse and placed it here, in public view, before Ingrid had a chance to say a word. Quaid arrived 20 minutes later with 2 men and a satisfied expression. There's the food your cook reported stolen, he said to the small crowd that had gathered. Moved from your ranch to the church kitchen without your knowledge, Mr. Whitcomb. I'd call that a serious breach of trust. Ansel looked at Ingrid once. Then he turned to the crowd. I authorized the use of Juniper Hollow's food for a community kitchen, he said. Miss Nystrom moved nothing without my knowledge. Anyone who tells you otherwise is mistaken. Quaid smiled and said nothing further on the subject. He didn't need to. He'd already put the idea in people's heads. And a denial rarely scrubbed a thing out completely. Odessa arrived shortly after. She had brought her case records, organized by date, and she set them on the church table without being asked. She told the gathering what she'd observed, which families were sick, what symptoms they presented, how long the pattern had been building. She said it plainly and professionally, and she credited Ingrid with making the connection she herself had missed. That carried weight. Odese's opinion in Copper Hollow carried a great deal of weight. By afternoon, the community kitchen was operating out of the church. Ingrid had learned early in her working life that an organized kitchen was a safer kitchen, and a safer kitchen produced more food for more people with less waste. She set up an inspection table at the entrance. Every sack of grain that came through got examined before it went near a pot. She showed the volunteers what to look for: the color of the kernels, the smell of the bag, the feel of the flour between the fingers. She explained why it mattered. Wet grain stored in a sealed space could develop a fungus that no amount of cooking burned out. It didn't smell burned or bitter. It smelled almost normal, which was exactly why it was dangerous. 3 neighboring ranches sent contributions by the end of the day: potatoes, dried beans, preserved venison, corn, a pail of butter, 2 gallons of milk. None of it came from Quaid. Perry sat in the corner of the church kitchen for 2 hours with a large sheet of paper, building a chart. He'd organized it himself without being asked: household names down one side, flour batches across the top, illness dates in the middle columns. It was meticulous. It was also the clearest visual record they had of the pattern. A Norwegian church group had arrived in Copper Hollow 2 days earlier, traveling east. Their minister found Ingrid that evening while she was cleaning the inspection table. He had a letter of introduction from a family in Minnesota who knew Ingrid's mother. The group was heading back in the spring and had connections to a boarding house operation that needed an experienced cook and manager. They could offer safe passage and a starting position. If things went well, there was talk of partial ownership within a year. Ingrid held the letter and read it twice. She thanked the minister and told him she'd give him an answer by morning. Ansel was waiting by the wagon when she came out. He'd seen the minister. What did he want? She told him. Ansel was quiet for a moment. He looked at the church, at the light in the windows, at the smoke rising from the kitchen. He looked at her. You should go, he said. Take the position. Get out of Copper Hollow before Quaid decides that embarrassing you isn't enough. Ingrid looked at him directly. You want me to leave? I want you safe. That's a different sentence. He exhaled slowly. Ingrid, if something happens to you because you stayed here to fight a battle that this town should be fighting for itself. He stopped. He started again, more quietly. I want you to leave because the possibility of losing you frightens me more than losing this ranch. She heard that. It landed honestly. Your honesty matters, she said. It does. But fear doesn't give you authority over my choices. His jaw tightened. I'm not trying I leave. You're encouraging it. You're framing it as concern for me, while knowing it would also end the investigation. She wasn't angry. Not exactly. She was clear. Those aren't the same thing as asking what I want to do. He stood there. She folded the minister's letter and put it in her coat pocket. I haven't decided anything yet. The letter from Quaid's financial office came the next morning. All credit connected to Juniper Hollow suspended effective immediately. Feed supplies canceled. Grain account closed. Without credit, the ranch couldn't carry the cattle through to spring. Quaid knew exactly what he was cutting. Ingrid sat at the kitchen table with the letter and her ledger open beside each other. She looked at the ledger, at the list of ranches that had donated to the community kitchen, at the families who had stopped using Quaid flour and were already seeing improvement, at the inspection system she'd built in 2 days from almost nothing. Quaid's power over this town worked because everything went through him. Food, credit, charity, supply. If people could get what they needed from each other instead, his leverage had disappeared. That wasn't a new idea. It was how communities survived before men like Quaid built themselves into the center of things. She went back to the church. She spent the afternoon reorganizing the kitchen into a direct exchange. Families brought what they had in surplus and took what they lacked. She kept records of everything, careful and transparent. No one left with more than they needed. No one left with nothing. By evening, 4 families had eaten without touching anything connected to Quaid Mill. She told the minister her answer. She was staying. He accepted it graciously and left her a contact name in Minnesota in case she changed her mind. Ansel didn't say anything when she told him. He looked at the floor for a moment, then he looked up. Full authority over the relief kitchen, he said. Whatever decisions you need to make there, you make them. You don't need to ask me first. Thank you. He left it at that. No argument. No further attempt to convince her otherwise. She was putting out the kitchen fire that night when she heard it. A crash from the back of the church. Then another. She went around the side with the lamp. Two of the large cooking pots had been knocked from their hooks. The small iron stove used for the inspection table had been tipped on its side. The leg was bent at an angle that meant it wouldn't sit level again without repair. A crate of dried beans had been split open across the floor. She stood there in the cold, holding the lamp. Ansel came around the corner behind her. He looked at the damage. Neither of them spoke for a moment. He's telling you what comes next, Ansel said. I know. She went inside and started picking up the beans. She was still at it an hour later, working in the lamplight, when she heard boots on the church steps. She stood up straight. The woman in the doorway was young, 29 or so. She was holding something against her chest, with both arms wrapped in her coat. Her hair was wet from the blizzard outside, and her face was pale from the cold, and something more than cold. She looked at Ingrid for a moment, then at Ansel, then back. I work in the bookkeeping office at Quaid Mill, she said. My name is Etta Gresham. She held out what she'd been carrying. A ledger, the cover charred along one edge, several pages blackened and stuck together at the top. Quaid knew the flour was poisonous, she said. I have his signature. Etta's hands were shaking. She'd walked 2 miles in the blizzard with a burned ledger pressed against her coat. Ingrid brought her inside and poured hot water for tea. She let the woman warm up before asking anything. Etta told it plainly, once she could. She'd been keeping books at Quaid Mill for 4 years. She'd seen the original grain inspection report the previous November, the one that arrived with the flood-damaged shipment. It stated clearly that the grain was unfit for human or animal consumption. Quaid had read it. He'd signed it. Then he'd ordered her to copy the records, using falsified numbers, and burn the originals. She hadn't burned all of them. She'd kept a set of the copied delivery records hidden in her desk. When Quaid found out this week that she'd kept anything at all, he'd ordered the office cleared. She'd managed to pull the ledger before his men got to her desk. But they'd caught the corner of it with a lamp. She spread the damaged pages on the table. Most of it was legible. The delivery dates, the household names, the batch codes, all matching what Ingrid had already documented from the outside. The original inspection report, Ingrid said. The one with his signature. Where is it? Etta wrapped both hands around the mug, locked in the mill office, the top drawer of his private filing cabinet. She paused. He hasn't destroyed it yet because he thinks no one knows it exists. How much time do we have before he realizes you're gone? He'll know by morning. Ingrid looked at the burned ledger. Then at Ansel. He was reading the pages she'd spread on the table. His face was tightening as he moved through them. I need to get into that office before he moves the file, Ingrid said. Ansel looked up. No, the signed report is the most important piece of evidence we have. His signature, under that warning, alongside his order to grind and distribute anyway, that ends his ability to claim ignorance. You're talking about entering a locked building owned by the man who just destroyed the back of this kitchen. I know what I'm talking about. Ingrid, he set the papers down. I cannot watch another woman walk into danger, trying to prove something that this town should have listened to 2 years ago. Then come with me. That's not. If you're afraid for me, come with me. Bring Tomas. We go in together. It's too much risk. He has men watching that mill. If he catches you inside, he will destroy everything we've built and call it lawful protection of his property. He crossed his arms. I won't allow it. The word landed wrong. Etta looked down at her mug. Ansel heard it too, the moment after he said it. Ingrid turned to face him fully. You cannot allow it, she said. That's not what I. You're afraid, so you're deciding for me. Again, her voice stayed even. Every time I get close to something that frightens you, you put yourself between me and it and call it protection. I am not Elspeth. You cannot keep me alive by turning me into her ghost. That's not what I'm doing. You told me I couldn't go into the church. You told me I should take the Minnesota position and leave. Now you'll not allow me to enter the mill. She looked at him steadily. Do you hear the pattern? His jaw was tight. The silence stretched out. Then something broke loose in him. Fear turned to something harder. You are someone I hired, he said. A cook. You have no right to make decisions that endanger this ranch or the people connected to it. The room went very still. Etta looked at the table. Ingrid said nothing. She held his gaze for one more moment. Then she turned, picked up her coat, and walked out. She sat in the small side room off the church kitchen for a long time. Cold, quiet, running the words back through her mind. Someone I hired. A cook. She'd heard worse. She'd heard it more skillfully delivered, with more contempt packed into fewer syllables. Gerald Fitch, on the stagecoach platform, had done it in front of 20 people. This was different because she hadn't expected it from him. She would finish the evening meal. She would make sure Etta had somewhere safe to sleep. In the morning, she would collect her wages and her things and leave Juniper Hollow. Perry found her before she got back to the kitchen. He was standing in the doorway from the church hall, his coat on, his boots unlaced, like he'd come quickly. I heard him, Perry said. Ingrid looked at him. I don't want you to leave. He said it directly, without performance. But I don't want you to stay only for me. He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. You shouldn't stay because I need you to. That's not fair to you. He was 9 years old, and he understood something his father hadn't managed tonight. Thank you, she said, and she meant it. She went back to the kitchen and started supper. An hour passed. She heard the door. Ansel came in and stood on the far side of the kitchen. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at her working at the stove, at the fire, at the wall behind her. I was afraid, he said, and I took it out on you. What I said was wrong, and it wasn't true. He didn't add anything to soften it. No explanation of what he'd meant, instead, no argument about what he'd been feeling. You have never been only the cook. Not one day since you arrived. She kept her hands on the pot. I know you regret it, she said. I do. Regretting it and understanding why it was wrong aren't the same thing. I know that too. She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression she recognized from the night they'd been trapped in the freight station. Open, careful, asking nothing. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. She reached up and put her hand briefly against the side of his face. He covered it with his. She kissed him. Once, quietly, without any urgency. He kissed her back the same way. She stepped back. That doesn't erase what you said. I know, he said. I mean it. We don't move past it, just because this happened. I'm not asking to. She looked at him for a moment. I'm staying one more night. There are families who need to be warned about the new charity shipment Quaid is sending to the school and the church. After that, I haven't decided anything. What do you need from me? Not what can I do, or let me help. He asked what role she wanted him to play. That was different. She noticed the difference. Be honest with me, she said. When you're afraid, tell me you're afraid. Don't make decisions for me, and call it something else. All right, she went back to the stove. She was ladling soup into bowls when Perry burst through the back door. He'd gone to help Amos distribute warning notes to families near the school. He had 3 biscuits wrapped in cloth, pulled from the batch Quaid's wagon had delivered to the schoolhouse that afternoon under the label of emergency charity rations. She recognized the smell before she even opened the cloth. She looked up. Perry was already setting the biscuits on the table. He'd broken off a corner of one on the walk home. He looked at her face. I only ate a small piece, he said. Then his legs went out from under him. Ingrid was around the table before he hit the floor. She caught his shoulders and lowered him. His body was shaking, his arms pulling inward, his back arching in a hard, involuntary spasm. She turned him onto his side immediately. She kept his airway clear and his head tilted. She spoke to him calmly, one hand on his shoulder, eyes on his face. "Ansel," she said. Ansel was already at the door. "Get Odessa," she said. Now, the seizure lasted less than a minute, but it was the longest minute Ingrid could remember. She kept Perry on his side, one hand on his shoulder, eyes on his face the whole time. She'd learned from a woman who worked with mining families in Minnesota that during a convulsion, you did not restrain the person, did not force anything into their mouth, and did not try to hold them still. You kept them from hitting anything hard, you kept their airway clear, and you waited. That was the full job until the episode passed. It passed. Perry lay still, breathing shallow but steady. His eyes were half open, and he didn't know where he was. 3 adults tried to crowd in around him. Ingrid put her arm out. "Give him air." Everyone stepped back. They stepped back. Odessa arrived 11 minutes later. She examined Perry, without rushing, checking his pupils, his pulse, the color in his fingers and lips. "This is consistent with everything we've been documenting," she said, keeping her voice low. "The neurological symptoms, the cramping, the convulsion. This isn't fever, it's exposure." Ingrid showed her the biscuits. She'd already broken one open on the table. The crumb was off-color in places, and when she pressed a cluster of the darker fragments onto a white cloth and held it to the lamp, the purple-black tinge came through clearly. Odessa looked at it for a long moment. "I'll stay with Perry," she said. "You two need to hear what Etta has to say." Etta was in the next room, her coat still on. "Quaid was at the mill tonight," she said. "He'd brought in 2 men from outside town. They were moving the remaining contaminated grain to the lower warehouse floor, intending to burn the building once the grinding finished and the evidence was gone. He wanted everything destroyed before the regional inspector arrived at the end of the week. The original signed inspection report was still in the filing cabinet in his private office. She was certain of it. If they waited until morning, it would be ash. Ansel looked at Ingrid. He didn't tell her to stay behind. He didn't list his objections. "Tell me the plan," he said. She told him. The 4 of them reached the mill before 10 o'clock. Ingrid, Ansel, Tomas, and Etta, moving on foot from the ridge road to avoid the lantern light near the main entrance. The mill was a large 3-story structure built where the creek dropped sharply enough to drive a water wheel. Lights burned on the upper floor. Tomas pointed. Shadows moved behind the upper windows. Etta shook her head before anyone asked. 3 workers who refused to grind the boiled batch. He locked them up there. They went in through the grain chute entrance on the south side. Ingrid had asked Etta about the building's layout on the walk over. She knew where the office sat, where the grinding floor was, and where the water wheel machinery connected to the drive shaft above. The smell inside was thick and wrong, old grain dust, and something sharper underneath it, lamp oil. She looked at the floor. A dark trail ran along the base of the west wall toward the dry straw stacked near the grain bins. She moved carefully. Grain mills were dangerous under ordinary conditions. The fine dust that settled on every surface and floated through the air during grinding was more combustible than most people realized. Enough of it, suspended in an enclosed space with a flame source, didn't behave like an ordinary fire. It could move through a room in less time than it took to draw breath. Working millers understood this. Quaid apparently didn't, or he'd forgotten. One of his men saw Tomas first near the grain bins. A brief struggle. Tomas handled it. Somewhere above, a lantern went over. Ingrid smelled it before she heard the shout. Oil catching, straw igniting. 2 of Quaid's men ran for the main doors. "Stop, flat and certain. Do not open those doors." They stopped. She turned to Ansel. "The main doors draw air in from outside. Right now the fire is small and the dust is settling. You open those doors, you pull a current through the whole ground floor. Everything suspended in the air goes with it." She kept her voice steady. "Ansel, take Tomas. Get upstairs, through the east stairwell, away from the west wall. Get those workers out. Then, she went to the ventilation shutters along the south wall. Mills were built with shutters, set into the upper sections of the exterior walls, specifically to manage airflow across the grinding floor without creating dangerous cross-drafts at ground level. She opened 3 of the south side shutters in sequence, low to high, creating an upward draw that pulled the smoke toward the ceiling and out rather than spreading it horizontally across the room. Then she found the water wheel control lever. Stopping the water wheel stopped the grinding stones, which stopped the machinery, generating new clouds of dust into the air. She pulled the lever. The deep rumbling under her feet slowed, groaned, and went quiet. Etta had gone straight for the office. She came out 2 minutes later with a leather folder pressed under her arm. Above, Ansel had the upper door open. 3 mill workers came down the east stairwell, coughing but moving. Tomas was the last one down. A beam on the west side gave way where the fire had caught hardest. The end of it came down across the grinding floor and struck Ansel across the shoulder as he cleared the bottom of the stair. He went to one knee. Ingrid reached him in seconds. She pressed her hand to his shoulder. Conscious, eyes clear, breathing. She looked at Tomas. He needs to get outside. Stay with him. Ingrid Ansel started. Tomas has you. She picked up the leather folder Etta had set down to help Ansel. I have the evidence. She found the signed report in the folder near the south exit door. At the top, in a clerk's formal hand, grain unsafe for human or animal consumption. Entire shipment must be destroyed. Below the printed warning sat Quade's signature. And below that, in a different ink, in his own handwriting, added after the fact, grind it with the batch reserved for indebted accounts. She folded the paper carefully into the front of her coat. Outside, Quade's wagon was gone. She ran to the ridge road. From the top, she could see 2 lanterns moving fast toward Copper Hollow. And from the center of town, light and gathering shapes. The winter food distribution. Announced. For tonight, families were already in line. Ingrid ran. She arrived with her coat open and her hair half undone from the run. The square held 30 people or more. Lanterns hung from the church posts. Quade's wagon sat at the center. Flour sacks stacked in the bed, and a woman, Ingrid, recognized from the schoolhouse, was leaning forward with a scoop, filling a cloth bag from the open top of the nearest sack. Red triangle stamped near the base. Ingrid walked straight to the table and pushed the scoop aside. The woman pulled back. People turned. Quade was on the far side of the wagon. He looked at her and arranged his expression into the practiced patience of a man whose tolerance was being tested by someone beneath his attention. This woman set fire to my mill tonight, he said to the crowd. He let the quiet settle first before he spoke, the habit of someone accustomed to being waited for. She's spent weeks spreading lies about my grain. Now she's come to disrupt aid to families who've struggled through a hard winter. People were looking at Ingrid, some uncertain, some already hostile. A few who'd eaten from the community kitchen watched carefully. Ingrid set the leather folder on the table beside the flour sacks. She did not raise her voice. I have flour samples, she said, from Juniper Hollow, from the schoolhouse, and from the Baggs families brought to the clinic when their children fell ill. She laid them out one by one, each labeled in her handwriting. Each one contains the same dark rye kernels. Each one carries a matching batch number. She turned to the nearest sack on the wagon and tipped it so the base faced the crowd. This one carries the same batch number. Quade looked at the crowd, not at her. A 198-pound hired cook with a history of dismissal walking into a public square to tell this town its food supply is poisonous. He shook his head slowly. Ask yourselves who benefits from that story. Perry came around Tomas's shoulder. He was still pale, still steadying himself, but he was carrying a rolled sheet of paper and his chin was level. He walked to the table and spread the chart out without asking permission. Every family on the sick list matches a batch number from the red triangle shipments, he said. He ran his finger down the columns. The household names on one side The flour codes across the top, the illness dates filled in between. None of the families that got grain from other sources appear on this list. Not one. Quaid made a dismissive sound. My son's documentation, Ansel said. He had come into the square while Perry was speaking. His arm was strapped against his chest, and his face was gray from pain, but his voice carried. Odessa stepped forward. She'd brought her case records. She laid them on the table and described 2 months of treating sick children and adults, the pattern she'd observed and documented, the symptoms consistent with ergot poisoning, a condition caused by a grain fungus that contaminated rye under damp storage conditions and attacked the blood vessels and nervous system. She explained that ergot-contaminated flour could not be made safe through ordinary cooking because the harmful compounds survived heat, she said. The pattern was unmistakable once the flour connection was made, she said. Ingrid Nystrom had recognized it before she did, and she said it clearly. Amos came forward after her. He read from his attendance records. He named the 6 students. He described which households they came from and what those households had in common. He had been keeping notes since the week Ingrid had come to his classroom. Etta opened the leather folder. She held up the inspection report and read it aloud, the warning printed at the top, Quaid's signature beneath it, and then his handwritten order added below in a different ink in his own hand. The square went very still. Quaid raised his voice for the first time. That document is forged. This is a coordinated conspiracy by a group of people with grievances against my business. My workers were coerced. 3 mill workers came around the side of the church, the oldest among them, a thick-armed man with flour dust, still in the creases of his coat, said he'd been grinding grain at Quaid Mill for 11 years, he said. Quaid had locked him and 2 others on the upper floor that very night when they refused to grind the contaminated batch. He said he'd seen the inspection report the previous November. He said he'd been told to say nothing or lose his position, his family's store credit, and any hope of settling his debt. The other 2 confirmed the same. Quaid turned toward the wagon. Ansel moved to the center of the square. Elspeth warned me, he said. No preamble, no softening. He said it to the crowd, and he didn't look away from them. My wife brought me flour samples 2 winters ago. She kept records. She came to the clinic. I told her she was exhausted and reading too much into it. I told her Quaid had a good reputation, and I trusted that more than I trusted what she was showing me. He stopped. I was wrong, and she paid for it. I'm asking you now to listen to what Miss Nystrom has shown you, because she was right about every piece of it. Quaid stepped off the wagon and moved quickly toward the road. Tomas stepped into his path before the horse had moved a foot. 3 mill workers came around the other side. Quaid turned and grabbed Etta's arm. He reached for the leather folder with his free hand. Ingrid was 4 steps away. She grabbed an empty flour sack from the table, wrapped it once around his wrist and forearm, and twisted. It bound his elbow and wrenched his grip sideways. He lurched off balance. She put her shoulder into the space his weight had just vacated. He went down hard. The mill workers were on him before he could rise. The square was silent for a full breath. Then a woman near the front of the line set her cloth bag down on the ground, looked at the wagon, and walked away from it. Others followed. Quietly, one after another, the flour sacks sat untouched. People were talking now, gathering around the evidence table. Amos and Odessa organizing the remaining crowd. Etta, shaken but composed, holding the folder close. Ingrid looked across the square. Ansel was making his way toward her through the press of people. Slow, his injured arm held tight to his side, his face drawn. He got within 20 feet of her. Then he stopped. His hand found the nearest post. He looked at her across the distance between them, and his legs gave out. She was moving before he reached the ground. She caught part of his weight and lowered him slowly. His skin was cold, and his breathing was tight and shallow, the smoke and cold and untreated shoulder finally collecting what they were owed. His eyes found her face. Still clear. Do not let them rebuild the mill the way it was, he said. Then he was gone. Ansel came back to himself on the third morning. He heard Ingrid before he opened his eyes. Her voice rising from the floor below, measured and sure, directing something in the kitchen. He lay still and listened to it for a while. The fever had lasted 2 days. Odessa had come twice daily. The shoulder would need months to recover fully, but the bone was intact, and the smoke had not settled deep into his lungs. He lay there and let himself feel how much that mattered. Perry was at the kitchen table when Ansel came downstairs. 3 books spread open in front of him, pencil tucked behind his ear. He looked up when he heard the stairs. "You look terrible," Perry said. "Thank you," Ansel said. He sat down. Ingrid came in from the pantry with a mug and set it near his elbow without ceremony. "Tea, hot, a spoonful of honey." "Odessa says light food for 2 more days," she said. "There's oat porridge." He ate it. He watched her move around the kitchen, checking a pot, wiping the work table, pausing to answer a question. Perry asked about a measurement in one of the open notebooks. Perry was building a recipe book. He'd explained it through the bedroom door while Ansel drifted in and out of sleep earlier in the week. Elspeth's dishes and Ingrid's dishes together, organized by season, head notes written in Perry's own hand, explaining where each recipe came from and what occasion suited it. It was a good project. Ansel thought so. News from Copper Hollow reached the ranch in pieces. Quaid had been removed from the mill by creditors whose other loans to him had defaulted once the fraud became public. Etta Gresham and 2 senior workers were organizing a cooperative council to operate the mill going forward. 3 mills in neighboring counties had been contacted about supplying grain, while the facility was cleaned and inspected. Odessa had submitted her case records to the Regional Health Authority with a formal request for mandatory grain inspection standards across the county. She had Ingrid's documentation supporting every claim. Most families who'd stopped using the contaminated flour were already improving. A few of the more severely affected would take longer. Perry had not had a single convulsion since the night of the mill. Juniper Hollow had taken a financial hit. Stolen food, suspended credit, a delayed spring planting. But the 3 neighboring ranches that had contributed to the community kitchen returned the favor differently than expected. One family sent 2 head of cattle. Another sent a work crew for a week. A third offered their surplus seed supply at no cost until fall. "You fed our families," they each said, in different words. Tomas became a formal partner in the cattle operation the 2nd week of March. Ansel had been thinking about it for 2 years. He signed the papers at the kitchen table with his good arm. Ingrid received 2 letters in the same week. The first was from the minister of the Norwegian church group. The Minnesota boarding house position was still available. She had until the end of the month. The second came jointly from Odessa and 3 members of the new mill council. A leadership position managing food safety and the community kitchen. Responsibilities outlined in general terms, specific conditions left open for negotiation. She read both at the kitchen table and left them there. Ansel saw them the next morning. He didn't ask about them directly. He went to the barn, came back at noon, and found Ingrid organizing the pantry. "The Minnesota letter came again?" he said. "I know, I read it." He stood in the kitchen doorway. His arm was out of the sling for the first time, moving carefully, but moving. "I'll help you pack when you're ready," he said. She turned to look at him. He meant it. No strategy in his face, no attempt to pull her back through the offer. He was giving it because he understood now that her right to leave wasn't something he could acknowledge only when it cost him nothing. She turned back to the shelf. "I haven't decided to leave," she said. "All right," he said. That afternoon, she went to town and sat across from Odessa and 2 mill council members with her own draft of conditions written out in her clear, close hand. Wages set at the rate a man in an equivalent position would receive. Partial ownership in the community kitchen operation. Decision-making authority over food safety standards and grain inspection protocols. Independent of council approval for routine matters. The council member read through it. looked at the other member, looked back at Ingrid. "These are reasonable," he said. "They are," Ingrid agreed. She brought the signed agreement back to Juniper Hollow and showed it to Ansel. He read it through and handed it back. "You negotiated all of it," he said. "Yes?" "Good." He looked at her directly. "I accept every condition. You're not a party to this agreement." "No," he said, "but I'm asking to be part of something adjacent to it." He didn't rush it. "I'd like to court you as an equal. I'm asking your permission to try." Ingrid held the folder and thought about it. Not long, but genuinely. "Yes," she said. "You can try." Spring arrived at the end of March. Snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, then the valley floor, then the road into town. The creek ran high and brown with snowmelt, and the air smelled like mud and pine and cold soil turning. On the first full supper of the season, the Juniper Hollow kitchen held more people than it had all winter. Ranch hands, Tomas and his wife, Amos, Odessa, Etta, two families from town who came to return, borrowed cookware, and stayed when they smelled what was on the stove. Ansel was standing near the window. He wasn't making a speech. He was just talking to her. "On the first day, I hired you only to cook." Ingrid was at the table, pouring coffee. She looked up at him. "I remember. You made that very clear." He looked around the room at Perry reading head notes aloud from his recipe book to Amos, at Tomas laughing at something his wife had said, at the crowded table, the full plates, the warm and loud kitchen. Then he looked out the window at the mill in the distance, rebuilt under new management, its wheel turning again in the spring creek. "You saved my son. You saved the people who work here. You saved this town." Ingrid shook her head. "I'd not do any of that alone." "No," he said, "but you were the first person willing to see what the rest of us had chosen not to see." He didn't ask if she would continue taking care of his household. He didn't ask if she was comfortable or settled or planning to stay. "Ingrid, would you choose to build a family with us?" She set the coffee pot down. "Yes," she said, "but not because you need someone to cook." He smiled, quiet, unhurried. She'd seen it before, but not often enough. Later, after the dishes were done, and the last guests had pulled on their coats, Perry arranged 3 books on the kitchen table. Elspeth's recipe notebook on the left, Ingrid's food inspection ledger in the middle, his own new family cookbook on the right, the ink still fresh in the binding. Ingrid stepped onto the front porch. Ansel came out beside her. The spring air moved across the yard. Behind them, the kitchen stayed full of noise, a chair scraping back, Perry's voice explaining something about cornmeal ratios to Tomas, laughter from the far end of the table. Ingrid stood in front of the open door, not inside with a task in her hands, not beside the stove, proving she belonged. Outside, present, occupying her own ground. She had not earned her place here by working until she became invisible inside the labor. She had chosen it on her own terms, with her own name on a signed agreement, and a man beside her, who had finally learned the difference between protecting someone and possessing them. All 198 pounds of her, unchanged, unapologetic, entirely her own. Behind them, the laughter continued. In front of them, the road ran out into the spring dark open in both directions. She stayed. Ingrid Nystrom walked into Copper Hollow with nothing but a trunk, a reference letter, and the quiet dignity of a woman who had been underestimated her entire life. She left having saved a child, exposed to fraud, fed a town through its hardest winter, and chosen her own future on her own terms. But what this story is really about runs much deeper than one woman in one Colorado winter. The first thing this story asks us to examine is the way we measure a person's value. Merritt Quaid weighed Ingrid by the pounds she carried. The Fitch family dismissed her at first glance. The town doubted her because she didn't look like the kind of person authority was supposed to belong to. And yet she was the only one who saw clearly what everyone else had chosen not to see. That is not a coincidence. People who are accustomed to being overlooked often develop a sharper eye for the truth, because no one ever handed them the luxury of looking away. The second thing this story teaches is the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. Ansel loved Ingrid, but in the beginning, that love expressed itself as decisions made on her behalf. He framed his fear as protection, his need to keep her safe as her obligation to comply. Real love, this story argues, does not ask the other person to make themselves smaller so your fear can breathe easier. It stands beside them, not in front of them. Ansel had to learn that lesson the hard way, and so do many of us. The third lesson belongs to every community that ever depended on one person, one company, or one institution for something as essential as food. Quade's power did not come from cruelty alone. It came from dependency. The moment families began trading with each other, inspecting their own grain, and feeding one another without passing through his system, his authority collapsed. That is as true today as it was in 1888. Monopoly over necessity is a form of control, and the answer to it has always been the same: people choosing to share what they have and see what is actually in front of them. Perry kept his mother's recipes and Ingrid's inspection records in the same book. That detail is the whole story in one image. The past and the present, grief and hope, held together not by forgetting, but by choosing to continue. Thank you for spending this time with Ingrid, Ansel, and the people of Copper Hollow. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and storytelling purposes only. All characters, events, and locations are entirely fictional, and any resemblance to real persons or actual historical incidents is coincidental.